only thing we have to fear is
in war,
fear itself.
there is no substitute for victory.
Let us never negotiate out of fear.
We stand undivided, forever united, fighting hand in hand for the liberty we've earned, for glory and honor, for our sons and daughters, ever mindful of the lessons we've learned. Let the torch of freedom burn.
President Thomas Jefferson said, "I know no safe depository of the ultimate powers of the society, but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion by education. This is the true corrective of abuses of constitutional power."
And that's the whole purpose of Foundations of Freedom Thursday here on WallBuilders Live. It's to get us all educated about the foundations that made our nation so great, the foundations of our Constitution and the principles that made America more free than any nation in the history of the world. And we love learning about it on Thursday. We appreciate you and your encouragement of this particular day of the week. I know that we've gotten a very, very, very positive response with what we've been doing with the programs. And David, when we talk about foundations of freedom, obviously the faith of the founders was a big part of that foundation.
It was a big part of the foundation, and they explained very clearly that that's the foundation from which virtually everything else flowed. Matter of fact, that's why in the Declaration of Independence, you start with the premise that there is a creator, and from that, you have the creator gives inalienable rights, and from that, you get the purpose of government is to protect the God-given rights. But if you don't have a creator, then you don't have limited government, because we say in the Declaration there's a creator, which then tells government there's something higher than you, government. You are not God. God is God. And then the second thing we say is, and he gives certain specific rights. So government, you're not in charge of everything that comes to our life. A lot of things come from God. So you keep your hands off those rights that God gives. That's the only way you have limited government. A secular government will never be a limited government. And the founding fathers understood that. So you have to start with that faith foundation. Now, trying to get academics today who acknowledge that openly, or who believe that the founding fathers are anything more than deists, is a hard thing to do. We've had other programs where we've talked about the actual demographics of university professors now. We talked in a previous program that liberals outnumber conservatives 8-1, Democrats outnumber Republicans 10-1 in university campuses. The most liberal sides of the university campus tend to be psychology, followed by sociology, etc. And so it is just difficult to get sound guys, but today we got a really sound guy on. Professor Mark Hall from George Fox University up in Oregon. No Mark, we've worked together on a number of projects. He's really good, and he's really cool in that he debates other professors on the faith of the founders. And he actually debates other Christian professors who have bought into the pagan view that, oh no, the founding fathers weren't religious and religion didn't mean much. So he's really a good guy. He's intellectually credentialed. He is academically credentialed. He's faith credentialed. He's got all that. And he's got a new book out. And he's got several other books, by the way. He and Dan Dreisbach, a professor from American, and Dan Dreisbach's another guy just like Mark, one of the great academics on the right side of stuff. These two guys do a series of books that are out. And so we're going to talk to Mark today about the new book that he's got on the Founding Fathers.
Excited to do it. Mark Hall is our guest. We'll be back in a moment here on WallBuilders Live.
John Adams said, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other."
This is David Barton with another moment from America's history. Revisions today often assert that our founding fathers were atheists or agnostics or deists. This charge is not new. In fact, Patrick Henry was even called a deist in his lifetime. Clearly, no one could question his patriotism, but Henry was hurt that they would question his Christianity. Against the charge that he was a deist, Patrick Henry thundered, "Deism, with me, is but another name for vice and depravity. I hear it is said by the deists that I am one of their number, and indeed, that some good people think I am no Christian. This thought gives me much more pain than being called a traitor. Being a Christian is a character which I prize far above all this world has or can boast." Patrick Henry was quick to refute the charge of deism and to declare his open belief as a Christian.
For more information on God's hand in American history, contact WallBuilders at 1-800-8-REBUILD.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
Thomas Jefferson said, in questions of power, then let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution.
Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us here on WallBuilders Live. Our guest today is Mark David Hall. He's co-author of a new book called Faith and the Founders of the American Republic. Did it with Daniel Dreisbach, a great professor out of American University. Mark David Hall is the Herbert Hoover Distinguished Professor of Politics and faculty fellow in the William Penn Honors Program at George Fox University. That is a mouthful, Mark.
Yes, sir.
Hey, thanks for coming on today, man.
Oh, I'm happy to be here.
So this is this particular book, Faith and the Founders of the American Republic. It's not a standalone. It's actually part of a series, right?
That's exactly right. Not a formal series, but over the last 10 years or so, Daniel Dreisbach and myself and Jeffrey Morrison, for two of them, have edited a collection of volumes that profile about 10 founders each. So collectively, the volumes profile 30 or so American founders.
What drew you to this? I mean, why did you want to dive in so deep with the founders and specifically their faith?
Well, first of all, I'm very interested in the American founding. I think it's just a fascinating collection of men and some women who are just brilliant and godly, and they created this constitutional order that has served America so well. So I'm interested in the era in general. As you know, oftentimes when scholars and when jurists look at the American founding, they distort it quite a bit, oftentimes by focusing on just a few founders. Great men, but men who early in life were maybe not as orthodox, some like Ben Franklin, or late in life, we know John Adams or Thomas Jefferson, we know from their private letters that they ceased to be orthodox. And so by focusing in on these very few men, and a few others perhaps, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, you get a really distorted picture of the American founding. So we've tried to expand the conversation to include these great men, to be sure, but then to talk about the host of founders, John Jay and Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, and Roger Sherman. There's just a host of folks who don't have any of these leanings towards heterodoxy and who still contributed mightily to creating our great nation.
When you do that, when you dive into their lives and you dig a little deeper and you begin to tell that bigger story of what happened in the founding and the type of atmosphere and the men that founded the country, what do you think that will accomplish for us today? I mean, what's your hope that the message would be, kind of the take-home message, and the impact that it would have on the culture?
Well, really, there's two concerns. One is just simply getting our history right. And, a lot of textbooks, a lot of scholars will say, look, the founders were deists who wanted the strict separation of church and state, and that's just not an accurate characterization of the founders. So we want to challenge that just as a matter of history. Perhaps more important, the Supreme Court has said that we have to interpret the Establishment Clause in light of the founders' views, and that's fair enough, but the problem is they then go and talk about Thomas Jefferson and James Madison as if they were the only founders that mattered. And even there, they look at just a few documents, like the detached memorandum and the letter to the Danbury Baptist. And so they conclude, look, the founders wanted a strict separation of church and state, so therefore we have to have that today. And by looking at the broad constellation of founders, including founders who were intimately involved in drafting the First Amendment, unlike Thomas Jefferson, who wasn't even involved in that process, you see that that's just historically, it's a completely absurd argument. The founders wanted nothing like the strict separation of church and state desired by the ACLU and such groups today.
That is not a small impact on the culture. I mean, what you're talking about is something that's had a really drastically changed who we are as America. So correcting that's a big deal. I mean, you're bringing out truths that are really at the heart of who we are, especially when it comes to our freedom of conscience and so many things that we hold dear as Americans. And if I understand you right, then it's not just that you're broadening the number of founders that people would look at, but also correcting some of the, I don't even know the right word, I guess, the misperception, if that's a word, of a particular founder. Like you said, with a Madison or a Jefferson, they've taken one writing or two writings or just a handful out of thousands of writings and really distorted what these men really believed in their lifetime, certainly in the lifetime when they were actually serving the nation and in positions of leadership.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. So, Jefferson and Madison did want a stricter separation of church and state. They wanted a more strict separation of church and state than most founders. But even they, were willing to blur the lines sometimes. So Madison, for instance, issued calls for prayer and fasting as president. Jefferson, of course, signed this treaty with the Kaskaskia Indians, providing fund for a minister. So even, famously, as Daniel Dreisbach has shown in his great book on Thomas Jefferson and the Wall of Separation, I think it was a day after, maybe 2 days after, I think the day after, Jefferson wrote his letter to the Danbury Baptists, wherein he describes a wall of separation between church and state. The day after, he went to worship services in the U.S. Capitol building. So that's not the sort of separation that Americans United and the ACLU would have us embrace today.
No doubt about it. Got to take a quick break. Our guest today is Mark Hall. He's the co-author of Faith and the Founders of the American Republic, co-authored with Daniel Dreisbach. Back in a moment here on WallBuilders Live.
Abraham Lincoln said, "We the people are the rightful masters of both Congress and the courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who pervert the Constitution."
This is David Barton with another moment from America's history. Federal courts have made several amazing rulings recently, ordering the removal of a cross from a cemetery, banning religious holiday displays, removing the Ten Commandments from public view, prohibiting student prayers whether verbal or silent, and numerous other similar restrictive rulings. As one current justice has noted, the Supreme Court has now become, quote, a national board of theology. Our founding fathers would be astounded. They designed the First Amendment to keep the federal courts completely out of this issue. As Thomas Jefferson forcefully declared, "I consider the federal government as prohibited by the Constitution from meddling with religious exercises." The First Amendment was designed to keep decisions on religious expression out of the federal courts and in the hands of the local communities.
For more information on God's hand in American history, contact WallBuilders at 1-800-8-REBUILD.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
Samuel Adams said, "The liberties of our country and the freedom of our civil constitution are worth defending against all hazards, and it is our duty to defend them against all attacks."
We're back. Thanks for staying with us here on WallBuilders Live. Our guest today is Mark Hall, co-editor of Faith and the Founders of the American Republic. Mark, we've been talking about just the way that the whole distorted view of separation of church and state has permeated the culture and really been bought into by so many scholars and jurists, especially judges. I mean, we seem to hear that distorted view of history often in court cases, and it's had a tremendous negative impact on our culture and our nations. Why are they buying that? Why are they not studying and looking at a broader view of our history?
That's a big question. It's a complicated question. I think in the late 19th and early 20th century, anti-Catholicism had a lot to do with it. Basically the public schools were Protestant schools, and when the Roman Catholics started saying, "Hey, this isn't fair, we want to have Catholic schools," people started talking about the separation of church and state. "Oh, we can't fund the Roman Catholic schools; they're sectarian." But they were perfectly happy to have these Protestant schools and these Protestant public schools. My own great state of Oregon, believe it or not, banned all private schools in the 1920s, and it just so happens, of course, that every single one of them was a Roman Catholic school.
Wow.
With one exception. And so there was this anti-Catholicism that led to these Blaine amendments, and I think eventually fed into the U.S. Supreme Court opinions. And then as we progress through the 20th century, you get some founders who, some justices, for one reason or the other, think the separation of church and state, a very strict separation of church and state, is good public policy. Maybe they were more, rationalists, or, in some cases they might be believers. Baptists historically have wanted a stricter separation of church and state than many other Americans, such as in the founding era, the Presbyterians and Congregationalists. And, they come to their, this view for different reasons. But, I think it became pretty widespread in the mid-20th century among justices. And yet it's very unpopular in the nation. And so one easy way to sort of avoid the political firestorms of removing teacher-led prayer from public school, for instance, is to say we don't have a choice in this. It's what the American founders wanted. So we aren't just making up our own public policy. We have to do this. So I think history provided an important political cover for the justices who wanted this stricter separation of church and state.
Yeah, history or distorted history, or I should say a limited view of history. Maybe that's a better way to put it for some of these justices that have zeroed in, like we said, on just a document here or a document there. Do you think it's helping? Do you think, in the series you guys have written, the efforts that have been made by others like David Barton and others that have tried to bring back the truth of the founders and broaden this view so that we studied more than just one or two or three or a handful of these guys? Do you think that there are some changes now that people are beginning to really discuss this issue with frankly, more information?
I think there absolutely have been changes. I think from 1947, where we had the Amercian versus the Board of Education decision, really until 1983, virtually every justice, it seemed, with the few little exceptions, embraced this idea that Thomas Jefferson and James Madison represent the founders, and they wanted the strict separation of church and state. In 1983, William Rehnquist came out with this great dissent in Wallace versus Jaffrey that said, no, we need to interpret the First Amendment in light of the founders, but there's a different story here, and he made a very different argument. And I think because of his work and then the work of a variety of scholars and other writers, we've expanded the conversation, so just no one can, in good faith, make that sort of argument anymore. Certainly on the U.S. Supreme Court, you have 4 or 5 justices that thoroughly understand the proper view of history. And what you've seen is a separationist on the court. Someone like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she just doesn't touch history with the 10-foot pole because she knows that it's a losing argument, I think. Of course, she can just rely on these older precedents that relied on bad history, but that allows her to, get her end, and the other separationists will do a similar thing. So, yeah, I think by removing history from the arsenal of the separationists, it's very much opened the door, for things like school vouchers that would go to religious schools and student-led prayer in public schools and Bible clubs in public schools. I think it's opened the door for these sorts of things in healthy ways.
And is it, do we need to think in terms of, decades to turn things like this around? I mean, it seems like it doesn't happen overnight. I mean, what you're doing is something that takes a long time to plant those seeds, get people to study, begin to open their minds to say, hey, we need to look at more than just a few folks. Is that the view you take, that this is something we have to think of in terms of, hey, it takes a while to win these important battles?
Oh, absolutely. Sure, it takes a while, and then we always have to be educating the next generation, right? If we cease doing that, then we could lose everything we've gained in one generation.
Yeah, it's got to be that way. Last thing I'll ask you, how does this one differ from your other books that are on the same type of subject but different focus?
This one actually has some pretty cool thematic chapters. So we have a chapter on Jews in the American founding, a chapter on how the Bible is used by the founders, and even the individual chapters are more aimed at shining light on the tradition. So we have John Dickinson and the Quaker contributions to the American Constitution. We have a chapter on Bacchus and Leland and the Baptist contributions to the creation of the American Republic. So it's a bit more thematic in nature, but still, we do profile some individuals, and so it's a great way if you want to see part of this greater story, and you don't have time to read a dozen different biographies, this book and others in the series are a good way to begin to get a good overview of religion in the American founding.
Well, as we let you go, what's the best place to go get the book?
Probably what ordering on Amazon is the best.
All right, and the title, once again, Faith in the Founders of the American Republic. Mark Hall, thank you so much. Appreciate your time being with us, Professor.
Hey, thank you very much, Rick. Have a good day.
You too. Back in a moment with David Barton.
Calvin Coolidge said, "The more I study the Constitution, the more I realize that no other document devised by the hand of man has brought so much progress and happiness to humanity. To live under the American Constitution is the greatest political privilege that was ever accorded to the human race."
Have you ever wanted to learn more about the United States Constitution but just felt like, man, the classes are boring, or it's just that old language from 200 years ago, or I don't know where to start? People want to know, but it gets frustrating because you don't know where to look for truth about the Constitution either. Well, we've got a special program for you available now called Constitution Alive with David Barton and Rick Green, and it's actually a teaching done on the Constitution at Independence Hall in the very room where the Constitution was framed. We take you both to Philadelphia, the cradle of liberty and Independence Hall, and to the WallBuilders Library, where David Barton brings the history to life to teach the original intent of our founding fathers. We call it the Quick Start Guide to the Constitution because in just a few hours through these videos, you will learn the Citizen's Guide to America's Constitution. You'll learn what you need to do to help save our constitutional republic. It's fun, it's entertaining, and it's going to inspire you to do your part to preserve freedom for future generations. It's called Constitution Alive with David Barton and Rick Green. You can find out more information on our website now at wallbuilders.com.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
Abraham Lincoln said, "We the people are the rightful masters of both Congress and the courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who pervert the Constitution."
Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us here on WallBuilders Live, and it is our job to overthrow men that pervert the Constitution, but the only way we know who's perverting the Constitution is if we study the history and we study the Constitution and we know the truth about those things. So that was pretty cool to hear from Mark Hall. David, we've had Professor Dreisbach on, and that's who he's doing some of these books with. That's the first time we've had a chance to have him on. What'd you think?
Good stuff. And again, Mark's a good guy, and he's exactly right. So many of the other academics focus on the unorthodox. As he said, Franklin in the early years of his life, or Adams and Jefferson in the latter years, and that's who they try to make into the whole of the Founding Fathers. And if you look at so many books that are out there on the Founding Fathers, instead of having 250 Founding Fathers like we normally would, 56 signers of the deck and 55 who wrote the Constitution, 39 who signed it, 90 who did the Bill of Rights, the dozen or so generals, actually 17 major generals of George Washington who helped secure freedom. You go through the three authors of the Federalist Papers, and John Jay wasn't a signer of a document, but he's certainly a founding father. Patrick Henry didn't sign a document. He's a founding father. I mean, you go through these guys, you get about 250. And most books today that look at the founding fathers look at just a handful. And they take the unorthodox and say, this is what they were all like. And what Daniel and Mark have done have gone to the others. As you mentioned, that John Dickinson's got a chapter in this thing. Mark just finished a book on James Wilson, one of the great founding fathers nobody ever talks about, second most active member of the Constitutional Convention. So they do it, and they do it academically. They have other professors contribute. And like I mentioned, they're willing to take on other professors. And even in this book, there may be some chapters that folks won't agree with, and some of the chapters that even that Daniel and Mark don't agree with. Some of the guys make the founders less religious than what Daniel and Mark and the rest of us believe to be, but they don't run from that debate and they don't run from that argument, and they give the other side very well. So it's good stuff. But I like what Mark said about we're starting to be able to expand the number of founders that people know about, and that's a good thing. And that reminded me that at WallBuilders, and we have groups of interns coming through WallBuilders regular basis, particularly in summer as kids are out of college. We have all sorts of intern groups coming through WallBuilders. And one of the things we do in the weeks that we have them is we have them expand their knowledge of the founders. And so I was with the group of interns today that we have for this session. And one of the things we do is we say, okay, there's 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence. We want you, each one of you, to take a signer of the Declaration you've never even heard about before and research them and research their faith. Find out about them, find out what they believed, find out what they did. And that's always one of the most fun parts of the interns being here is they learn stuff they've never even heard about before. Great guys. Then we'll have them on one session. You got to choose a signer of the Constitution you've never heard about. And then on one session, you've got to choose a military general from the Revolution you've never heard about. And then on one session, you got to choose one other founding father that you've never heard about. And so as you go through these lists of founding fathers that are readily available, you start finding out there's some really cool guys that nobody ever talks about. How come they don't talk about them today? And again, faith is usually the reason they don't talk about them. So Mark's right. It's great news that we're starting to expand the number of founding fathers that people do learn about. And that's one of the things that really is beneficial. And Mark and Daniel are helping to do that in the academic area, just like we have to do it in the popular area with the books we do that are really read by the general populace. They do it in the academic area and are making academics relook and rethink at what they teach and what they believe about the founders.
Well, the great thing about that is it's generationally will have an impact. If it's in the academic area, maybe a lot of these professors that are on the wrong side of this and looking at a very pigeonholed one perspective on this history will open their eyes and begin to share that with their students. So, what's that, 10, 15, 20 years from now?
I mean, you asked him at the point about knowing the faith of the founders. He said, well, there's two reasons for that. First concern is getting our history right. Bingo. I mean, that is the first concern, is you should be getting history right as a teacher, professor. And he said the second point is that it affects our constitutional interpretation, which thus affects national policy. So those are two great points for why you got to get it right in the academic community. One is you want history right, but two is it does affect national policy. And by the way, I love what he said about Supreme Court Justice Ginsburg. He said Ginsburg doesn't touch history with a 10-foot pole because she knows it's a losing argument. Yeah, exactly. I mean, she can't argue history because she'll lose every time with her viewpoint. But at least people are starting to recognize that. And of course, Mark recognizes that from having dealt with all the history he does. But he's just a really good professor, one of the good guys out there, and it's going to be a really useful academic book that he's got.
Well, we encourage folks to read it because it will help them as well in terms of teaching their kids and their family and their friends. I mean, we've got to get educated on these things. It's just a great, I always say ammunition. I know I think in terms of guns a lot, but it's great information, and it's great ammunition if you want to be able to win the fight when it comes to discussing history with folks and get the truth out there. Appreciate him coming on. Thanks to Mark Call. Thank you for listening to WallBuilders Live.
Thomas Jefferson said, "The constitutions of most of our states and of the United States assert that all power is inherent in the people, that they may exercise it by themselves, that is their right and duty, to be at all times armed, and that they are entitled to freedom of person, freedom of religion, freedom of property, and freedom of press."
We stand undivided.